Title: The Last Train. The empty platform. The station clock struck 11:59 p.m. The sound echoed through the empty terminal, bouncing off the tiled walls like a whispered warning. Ethan Moore shivered, pulling his coat tighter around him. The last train was late. Again. The platform stretched into the distance, eerily silent. No other passengers, no station attendants, just Ethan and the flickering lights overhead. He checked his phone. No signal. The subway's Wi-Fi, which should have been working, was gone. He sighed, stuffing his hands into his pockets. Then, he heard it. A distant whistle. It didn't sound quite right. The tone warped and stretched, reverberating unnaturally as if bouncing off unseen walls deep in the tunnels. It seemed to come from every direction at once, surrounding him, closing in. For a brief moment, the sound lingered too long, bending and curling in a way that made Ethan's skin prickle. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it stopped. It wasn't just sound, it was a presence. The noise crawled under his skin, vibrating in his bones, stretching impossibly long, as if the air itself was resisting it. Then, just as suddenly as it came, it stopped. For a brief moment, Ethan thought he heard something else beneath the whistle, a faint hum, a chorus of voices overlapping, whispering things he couldn't quite understand. Then, silence. It wasn't just sound, it was a presence. The noise crawled under his skin, vibrating in his bones, stretching impossibly long, as if the air itself was resisting it. Then, just as suddenly as it came, it stopped. The sound was low and hollow, reverberating through the tunnels like a ghostly call. A faint vibration trembled through the platform beneath his feet. Then, the train arrived. 2. A train with no destination. It pulled in smoothly, its exterior sleek yet old-fashioned, like something out of a different era. The doors slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a dimly lit interior. The seats were velvet, the walls paneled in dark wood, the floor covered in an intricate carpet. Ethan hesitated. The air inside the carriage felt thick, almost pressing against his skin, like the weight of unseen hands. The silence was unnatural, not just an absence of sound, but an intentional void. Under his feet, the floor didn't feel solid. The plush carpet concealed an uneasy sensation, as though something beneath it was shifting, breathing. For a brief moment, he swore he felt it pulse just once, like a slow heartbeat. A strange chill crept along his spine, as though unseen fingers trailed down his back. The air inside the carriage was thick, carrying a scent that was faintly metallic, like rusted iron. As he stepped inside, the floor beneath his feet felt softer than it should, almost as if it gave way slightly, like damp earth. A strange chill crept along his spine, as though unseen fingers trailed down his back. The air inside the carriage was thick, carrying a scent that was faintly metallic, like rusted iron. This wasn't the train he had taken before. The subway in his city was modern, metallic, and sterile. This was something else. Something older. But there was no other way home. With a deep breath, he stepped inside. The doors slid shut immediately. The train lurched forward, and the lights flickered. 3. The passengers who don't belong. Ethan took a seat near the middle of the carriage, exhaling slowly. For the first time, he noticed the other passengers. They sat perfectly still. A woman in a long black dress, her head bowed, hands folded in her lap. A man in a suit, reading a newspaper, but his hands never turned the page. A child, sitting with a teddy bear, her face hidden beneath a hood. Something was wrong. None of them moved. None of them breathed. And then, as if on cue, one figure turned first. A woman in a black dress, sitting closest to Ethan, moved her head just a second too soon, her neck twisting in a slow, deliberate motion. The others followed, one after another, like a grotesque wave of marionettes being guided by unseen strings. The delay made it worse, unnatural, calculated. Their eyes, hollow and unblinking, reflected the dim light in a way that made them seem almost hungry. Their movements were unnatural, too slow, too synchronized, as if they were marionettes being guided by invisible strings. Their eyes, hollow and unblinking, reflected the dim light in a way that made them seem almost hungry. Ethan barely noticed it at first, But then it became clear their lips were moving. No sound came out, but their mouths formed silent words, repeating something over and over. Their movements were unnatural, too slow, too synchronized, as if they were marionettes being guided by invisible strings. Their eyes, hollow and unblinking, reflected the dim light in a way that made them seem almost hungry. All at once. 4. The conductor's warning. Ethan's heart pounded as he gripped the armrests. The train picked up speed, the tunnel outside blurring into a dark void. A voice crackled over the intercom. "This is the last stop. Please remain seated." The sound was warped, stretched, as if spoken from underwater. A figure appeared at the far end of the carriage's conductor. He wore a uniform that looked decades out of date, his cap tilted slightly forward, casting a shadow over his eyes. His face was unnervingly blank. He stepped closer. Ethan swallowed hard. "Where does this train go?" The conductor didn't answer. Instead, he held out a small, yellowed ticket. Ethan hesitated before taking it. As soon as his fingers touched the paper, the train went completely silent. The lights flickered again. The passengers were gone. The window show, the past. Ethan shot up from his seat, his breath quick and shallow. He turned toward the windows. The tunnel was gone. Instead, he saw streets he recognized, but not as they were now. Buildings that had been torn down stood tall again. Old cars rumbled down cobblestone streets. People in 1920s attire strolling the sidewalks. He was looking at the past. Ethan turned to the conductor. "What is this?" The conductor's mouth barely moved as he whispered, "The last ride." The train jerked, and the scene outside changed. Now he saw himself. 6. The moment he forgot. Ethan stood frozen as he watched the scene unfolding outside the train window. It was a subway station, but not the one he had just left. He saw himself, standing on the platform, looking at his phone, waiting for the train. Then, a shadow moved behind him. Someone pushed him. Ethan's body fell onto the tracks. He tried to scream, but the train's brakes screeched, drowning everything out. The memory hit him like ice. He had already died, and now he understood. 7. The passengers are waiting. Ethan turned back toward the carriage. The passengers had returned. They were watching him, their expressions now clear. Not blank, but sad, resigned. They weren't passengers. They were souls. Everyone who had taken the last train. Ethan was one of them now. The conductor nodded slowly. "Take your seat." Ethan felt his legs move, though he hadn't commanded them to. He sank into an empty chair near the window, his hands gripping the old velvet cushions. The intercom crackled one last time. Final stop. The train plunged into darkness. For a split second, the lights flickered just once. In that brief moment, Ethan saw them. Hands, dozens of them. Pale, bony fingers gripping the seats, crawling up the walls, stretching toward him. The lights failed again, swallowing everything in blackness. Then, something else. 2 pinpricks of light appeared in the void, like distant eyes. No, not distant. Watching, waiting. A shuffling sound, a whisper his name. A cold, suffocating stillness settled over him. The space felt endless and yet crushingly small at the same time. Somewhere, deep in the void, something shifted. A whisper barely audible called his name. Ethan tried to move, but his body was no longer his own. Then, just before the final flicker of consciousness faded, he saw them hands, pale and skeletal, reaching through the darkness, pulling him into eternity. And just before the silence consumed him completely, he heard the distant whistle calling for the next passenger. A cold, suffocating stillness settled over him. The space felt endless and yet crushingly small at the same time. Somewhere, deep in the void, something shifted. A whisper barely audible called his name. Ethan tried to move, but his body was no longer his own. Then, just before the final flicker of consciousness faded, he saw them hands, pale and skeletal, reaching through the darkness, pulling him into eternity. And Ethan Moore was never seen again.